Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And as you can see, today's topic is a democratic experiment, leading up to the formation of the Constitution of the United States, our government. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those keywords at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect the words to each other and their larger historical significance. Now with that, let's begin. Now, the last lecture, of course, was about who really won the revolution. But before that, of course, was the Revolutionary War itself. And of course, in 1783, we had the Treaty of Paris, and now we have the task of forming a new government. Now, ultimately, the Constitution that we come up with marks a transformation of revolutionary political thought and premises. In many ways, the drafting of the Constitution and the ratification process depart from some of the key logic of the American Revolution itself in ways that some former colonists, some of our founding fathers, found deeply troubling. So the end goal, of course, of this lecture is to get to the Constitution and explain it to you. But this lecture is not about the Constitution, it's about getting there. Because by the time we get there, we can see that in many ways, the Constitution was a departure from some of those revolutionary ideas. Now, so let's begin. Treaty of Paris, 1783. The Treaty of Paris, besides bringing the war to a close, recognizing American independence, it does redraw the map. As you can see, we have the boundaries westward to the Mississippi, northward to Canada, and southward to Florida. But, very importantly, this new nation is under a lot of duress. We are surrounded by imperial European enemies. Ultimately, the French will have land west of the Mississippi. We have the Spanish to the south, and of course, the British to the north in Canada. All three nations, imperial powers throughout the globe, huge militaries, huge navies, and we owe them all money. We have a debt to all of them. We're new, we're weak. This is a very unstable time. And the key thing here is, what should our new government look like? What kind of government do we need? What kind of government do we want? And the reality is, three big things, or three keys, dominated the political rhetoric when it came to determining a new government. Number one, we had a tremendous fear of central power. Remember, we're fighting a war to get rid of a king, of a large central power in Parliament, who is exercising what we feel authoritarian, dictator-like control over our colonies. So we have a great fear of central power. Number two, we have a need for virtuous Republicans. Now, please note, this is not the political party Republican, but rather these are lowercase r Republicans. And they argue that to possess virtue, men need to be independent and capable of acting in the best interest of society. In other words, put their own interests and the interests of other men aside in the favor of the greater good. Thus, because, going back to our definition of what a proper Englishman was, right? Children, poor men, white women, African Americans, Native Americans are all dependent. They can't be virtuous Republicans. Therefore, it is only white land-owning property men who work the soil with their bare hands. These were the ideal, valorized, virtuous citizens as coined by Thomas Jefferson himself. So Republicanism, again, not the political party, marks an important expansion of liberty. We want broad-based liberty, right? According to Thomas Paine. broad-based equality. But that broad-based expansion of liberty is in many ways limited in some very important ways, especially if you're not white, propertied, or a dude. So 3 big things that are weighing on the minds of our founding fathers, the framers. Number 1, fear of central power. Number 2, a need for virtuous republicans. And then finally, number 3, fear of factionalism. Now, we need to be careful here because factionalism is often confused with political party. And they are not necessarily the same thing. They can be, but not necessarily. There was a fear of the danger of factionalism. Republicans, again, virtuous Republicans, they tended to be big readers of history. And when they looked back at some of the largest moments in antiquity, republics that flourished throughout the world, Rome, Greece, these famous republic nations or countries, they found that when these nations began to fall, when they began to crumble, was the most destructive element was that of factions. Now, what do you think a faction is, obviously? Well, it's when a group of self-interested men put their own interests above the interests of the republic. Again, obviously this would be men without virtue. So in antiquity, the question becomes, how do you deal with self-interest in faction? And this is where many, including James Madison, redefine the terms of the revolution. And we will eventually use that to frame a new constitution. So don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying political parties are bad. As we'll talk about in our next lecture, in a couple lectures from now, political parties are not evil in and of themselves. In fact, as we'll discuss in a couple lectures from now, when we start talking about the 1800 election between Thomas Jefferson and James Adams, both sides, both political parties represented by Jefferson and Adams, both sides believed that they were virtuous Republicans. Both sides, even though they had different opinions of government and the role of government, both sides believed that they had the plan to make America great. Both sides believed that they were putting the interests of the nation ahead of themselves. They just disagreed on the process to make America the best America possible, to make America great. Factions are different. Faction is when you put your party or your interest group, your group's interests and priorities ahead of the interests of the best of the nation. In other words, you're putting what is beneficial to you above what is best for the nation, to the detriment of the nation. There's a big difference there because in party politics, as it was designed in our original kind of forming 2 parties, both sides believed they were doing what's best for the nation. They just disagreed on the process. That's fine. That's healthy debate. But when you get to the point you can't debate, when you get to the point where you're putting your party above the process or the party above the interests of the nation, that's when there's a problem. When you're protecting the party at any cost rather than protecting the interests of the nation. That's factionalism. Now, all 3 of these things, again, fear of central power, need for virtuous Republicans, and fear of factionalism, are going to play a big role in forming our government. Now, I assume you already know this, but in case you don't, and it's a surprise, it's okay. The Constitution that we have now is not our original government. And in fact, our first government was known as the Articles of Confederation. But even that was just an extension of what we were experimenting with at the state level. And so during the 1770s, early 1780s, states were taking this burst of creative energy, infused and reflecting those revolutionary values, and began to experiment by, first of all, this radical idea of having a written constitution that made the government responsive to the people rather than the other way around. Because traditional monarchies in Europe were the people serve the government, the king, the monarchy. In a constitutional government, the government serves the people. And of course, this very much reflected revolutionary values of fear of central power. We wanted strong legislatures that had representatives from among the people with weak leadership, weak government. These are state constitutions. This means these state constitutions, these state governments, this fear of centralized power meant that the government would be more responsive to the people. So weak governors, strong legislatures. That's great, that's the state level, but what do we want for our nation's government? What kind of government do we want to run the entire country? Now, we just came out of a war against a large bureaucratic government who was imposing laws and taxes. And so once the Americans declared their independence in 1776, they needed a new government to run the country. So the first government designed to operate in the United States was the Articles of Confederation. Now, the argument became, do we want a big government or a small government? Do we want a strong, central, nationalized government where power only resides in the hands of a few people? That's known as federalism. A federalist government is one where we have a strong, active, national, central government, federal government, where power resides in the hands of a few people. On the other hand, there's what's called Anti-Federalists, and they're ones who are suspicious of the concentration of power in a few people's hands. They want to argue for a weak central government. Leave power at the local state level to decide. And so, is these two competing forces, these Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, that come together and form our first government known as the Articles of Confederation. It is proposed by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. It is proposed in 1777, ratified in 1781. And notice it reflects revolutionary values. There's no executive branch. There's no president here. There's no connection to the citizenry, though. It is merely a compact between the states. In other words, who has real power here? The states. And the people's say goes to the state level. Now, the Articles of Confederation represents a compromise between the two extremes, federalism, anti-federalism. Now, the Articles of Confederation is going to outline what this new government can do and what it can't do, for instance. Now, what it can do. Number one, the government has the power to regulate a few things. This new Articles of Confederation government can regulate the post office. The post office was seen as a national enterprise. You need good communication. And because it happens between states, the Articles government will regulate that. Number two, it can regulate foreign affairs. Why? Because if you're going to negotiate a treaty or a trade agreement with a foreign power, you don't want 15 individual state representatives with competing interests trying to negotiate one deal against, say, with Great Britain. So the national Articles government will regulate foreign affairs. And then number three, it can regulate Indians if the Indians lie outside of state. So if you go back to that map originally, you talk about the Northwest where modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan are. Those aren't states yet. And because they're just territories owned, not states, the Articles government can regulate Indians in those areas. But they can't regulate Indians in, say, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia. And the last thing it can regulate is interstate disputes. In other words, it can be a mediator between, say, if Virginia's got beef with South Carolina. It can regulate that. So it has these four areas it can regulate. Second thing that the Articles government can do is outline national citizenship. This is important. Again, this is seen as an important thing because if I have the rights of A, B, and C in, say, Virginia, if I travel to New York, I should have those same rights. And so the national government, Articles government, will be able to define and outline national citizenship. That you are an American citizen, you are not a citizen of a state. You are not a citizen of New York, Virginia, or later Texas. You are a citizen of the United States. However, there is also some very important limitations of the Articles government that are going to be severe, crippling limitations. Number one, the Articles government cannot demand or raise taxes. No. All it can do is ask for contributions. So, hey, do you want to give me some money so I can pay some bills? Oh, no hands going up? I understand. So it can't raise taxes, it can only ask for contributions. Number two, the government cannot raise an army. It can only ask for volunteers. Wow. So no national army here. Now, on the one hand, this makes a lot of sense, right? Remember those revolutionary values. Why did we fight the revolution? We were upset over the Quartering Act where the foreign government, this is the British, were forcing citizens to host their national troops. They also were upset over the taxation, right? Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, etc. Therefore, these two big things, revolutionary values, were put in as limitations of the Articles government. The problem is, how do you administer a nation if you can't raise taxes and have, constant revenue? How do you pay off your national debt, by the way? Second of all, how do you defend yourself without an army? Now, on the one hand, there are still military people here, but there are local state militias. So you have to rely on state militias rather than the federal national army. But what happens if there's a dispute in, say, what is now Ohio or Michigan? Which state militias go in there and who's telling them to go there? The Articles government? Probably not. Now, the Articles government is first discussed after Americans declared the independence, 1777. It'll be ratified in 1781. Now, you might think, why does it take so long? What gives? It takes 4 years to ratify this very weak, terrible, loosely affiliated government that's a compact between states. And you're right. Because there's a strong, big fear of central power, and they're afraid. They're fighting forward against tyranny of a central power. They don't want to replace it with something worse or the same. Now, I poke a lot of fun at the Articles government, and rightfully so. There was, however, a few things they will get done. And one of the things that is a success, theoretically, of the Articles government is the passage of the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance was important. It provided a mechanism to regulate settlement of Western lands. Again, early on, you're talking like Kentucky, Tennessee, up into Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. All these states that were not states yet, just territories. This provided the pathway to how a territory becomes a state. It laid out that you have to have so many people who are voting citizens. They have to form a stable government. That must be then draft a constitution, a state constitution, that must be approved by the government. Again, this is a process. This is important. How does a territory become a state? In addition, though, it also prevented the spread of slavery into those territories. Yeah, you heard that right. There was a prevention of slavery into these new Midwest, back then Northwest territories. But despite this important piece of legislation, which, by the way, keep this in mind, this will come back to haunt you later in the semester. After it is ratified in 1781, we're going to see problems immediately. Why? Well, as I already said at the beginning of this lecture, the United States, this new country, is in tremendous debt. And by the 1780s, both Great Britain and France want their money. And so the question is, how do you pay these foreign powers back? And how do you pay back your soldiers who fought for you and helped gain independence? You got to pay their pensions. You can't raise taxes, though. Oh, they want to spread out in all these new wonderful areas we got from the Appalachians to Mississippi? Fantastic. Wait, who's going to help protect these colonists and get rid of those Indians who already live there? No national army. And both of these issues will come to the forefront. These two key limitations, taxes and army, are going to cripple this new government. Let me give you examples of why and how. So, for example, they start pushing into places like Tennessee, places into Ohio. And immediately the problem is, who does protect these colonists? Who can protect them? Now, of course, the answer should be a national army. They should be sent out to deal. Because remember, the Articles of Government can regulate Indians in the territories, right? So these newly acquired territories, these battle-hardened, tested soldiers, go back to their farms. They decide we want to move out west to more land to live the American dream, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And they get there and they deal with Indians constantly. Hey, Articles of Government, national government, isn't this your job? It is. But they have no men. Instead, they call it the state militias. So which state militia is going into Ohio when Ohio is not a state? Pennsylvania? Why would Pennsylvania go help this new territory out? Why would those men, the militiamen, want to fight outside their state? It is not an effective national strategy. It's going to come back to haunt us in the 1780s and then again in the War of 1812. That's the first problem. The second problem, what really defines this and helps show this, is in an event known as Shays Rebellion in 1786. And again, this shows the profound threat to this government. It takes place in western Massachusetts. Yes, back to Massachusetts again, I know. Daniel Shays, the leader of this rebellion, he was a captain in the Revolutionary Army. He was committed to the revolutionary principles, but became very dismayed by the economic chaos that came after the war. In Hampshire County in western Massachusetts, he was joined by around 1,000 other local farmers who had been pushed to the brink of foreclosure on their property for non-payment of their debts or taxes. So let me back up. Why is this the case? You see, what happens is the Articles of Government needs money. They need to pay off foreign debt. They also need to pay soldiers' debt, soldiers' wages that are owed to them for fighting the war. Well, they can't raise taxes, so they rely on states to give them money. Now, states can raise taxes. A state in their constitution could, in their constitution, outline how they can raise taxes, and that often happened. Such was the case in Massachusetts, because you had to have a state government needs money. And theoretically, the state government would give a portion of their revenue to the Articles of Government. That's the way it's supposed to work. But Massachusetts could only pay their state debt if the people in Massachusetts paid their taxes. And so in Massachusetts, following the war, it's a downturned economy for a little bit. These farmers in western Massachusetts are crushed by new taxes that are being levied on their land by the state government. Many of the men who were hit by this economic chaos were former soldiers, who they themselves were awaiting back pay from the Articles government, the Confederation Congress in this case. Think about this for a minute. So the state of Massachusetts is raising their taxes to pay state debt and to pay for the Articles government, but they're not getting the tax money from these farmers because the farmers have no money to pay the taxes because they haven't got paid from the federal government. Yeah, it's cyclical. It's a big issue. And so what happens is these farmers are being foreclosed upon and thrown in jail for not paying their taxes. And again, is it legit? Yeah, there's a reason they can't pay tax. They're not paying their taxes because they have no money because the government hasn't paid them yet. Because the government doesn't have money because the state of Massachusetts hasn't paid them yet. Because the state of Massachusetts has no money because the farmers haven't paid them yet. It's a problem. And so with this context, lots of farmers began to rally behind Daniel Shays, who was a captain in the military. And they will begin demanding three things. Number one, debt relief. Guys, you're charging too many taxes here. We don't have any way to do it. We need the money from the government to pay our wages, our back wages, so we can pay the taxes. Give us debt relief. Number two, reversing prison sentences. In other words, these farmers were being foreclosed upon and thrown in jail for not paying their taxes when they can't. But then third, this is the interesting one. They want to move the state capital from Boston, which is on the coast, to a more centrally located position in the center of the state to make it closer and thus more responsive to the people. Again, notice how this is reflecting revolutionary values. They distrust central power. Now, these Shayites, they begin blocking debt collectors, harassing debt collectors. They force courts to close. They shut down auctions of foreclosed property. In short, they use the exact same kind of tactics that were used by the American colonists against the British leading up to the Revolution. They're performing the exact same methods that were used by the Founding Fathers in their push against the British. But this time, they're being persecuted as Americans because, well, they're not paying their taxes. Sound familiar, huh? Now, they were kind of allowed to do this until they tried to seize the federal arms arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. And once that happens, now the state militia is called in and quickly ends the rebellion. And so they were kind of allowed to protest a little bit and do these things. People understood the issue. But once they tried to seize the state arsenal of firearms in Springfield, Massachusetts, it was only then that the militias called in and the rebellions quelled. But this is when we start to say, Shays Rebellion has really kind of hit the nail on the head and said, wait, there's a problem here. We have a major issue with this Articles government. And so they decide, these founding fathers decide, Anti-Federalists and Federalists alike, they both say, you know what, we have a problem here. Now, they don't agree ideologically about what the new government should be or how we should change things, but what they do realize is that we need to change something. Something's wrong here. Of course, the argument comes down to big versus small government. And then do we just reform the Articles government or do we replace it? Now, I want to give you some example of who were leading Federalists and who were leading Anti-Federalists. Some of these men might shock you. Now, on the Federalist side, remember, they favor a strong central government. They believe that the Articles of Confederation is too weak. And so leading Federalists include, well, George Washington and James Madison. And they'll be opposed by Anti-Federalists, who feel that they want a weak central government. They feel that the Articles government is good, maybe a few tweaks, but it's good. And of course, your leading Anti-Federalists include famous people like Thomas Jefferson and a future alcoholic beverage, Samuel Adams. Fun fact, the picture you see there on the Samuel Adams label for the beer is not Samuel Adams. Yeah, that's very true. The man you see there is actually Paul Revere. Yes, the very famous, the redcoats are coming, the redcoats are coming. Paul Revere. So yes, Samuel Adams beer has the face of Paul Revere. Why? Well, my only guess is this guy does not have the face enough to sell beer. But nonetheless, all these founding fathers, Anti-Federalists, Federalists alike, gather together and decide that we need to do something. So they gather together and they hold what's called the Constitutional Convention in May of 1787. Now, this picture is kind of, well, not correct because there are some anachronisms. Number one is that the windows you see there were never opened because these founding fathers did not want the public to have any idea what was going on inside. It was May, it was hot, but they wanted to get together and discuss how do we either reform or replace the Articles of Government. And this becomes, of course, known as the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia in May of 1787. Now, on average, there are about 40 people there every day representing every state except Rhode Island. They're the smallest state, and they really just didn't care how about changing anything. Now, there's a rotating group of men that would show up, but on average, about 40 per day. Now, early on, George Washington is selected as the presiding officer. So in other words, he's in charge of these meetings for point of order, make sure things keep moving, etc. And the delegates do decide to keep the windows closed, draw the curtains, taking place in secret. Hot. In the summer, the room is crowded. They are not social distancing. Now, very early on, and of course, if you have watched the wonderful stage play, Hamilton, you probably already know this. If you haven't, it's now available to watch on your television set on Disney+. But this delegation begins on May of 1787. Believe me, everyone in the room has their version, their vision of what the new government should be or reform. Now, early on, one thing they kind of all will concede, right? Federalists, Anti-Federalists, they all concede on one thing. The Articles of Government is a failure. You can't do enough to reform it, therefore it must be replaced. It must be replaced. And of course, everyone has an idea now, what do you replace it with? And one by one, everyone would give their vision. Now, early on, one individual who will speak at the convention offers his plan for the new government. And of course, his name is Alexander Hamilton. Now, we talked about Federalists already, right? People like James Madison, people like George Washington. But the most Federalist of all Federalists is Alexander Hamilton. He is Mr. Federalist. Now, a little background in case you have not watched the stage play or you didn't quite fully understand it. Alexander Hamilton was born in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. He became an orphan at a very young age. He lost his mother, never really knew his father. So he's an orphan boy. Now, at the age of 13, he's very fortunate. He is sent to the colony of New York, and in New York, he's taken in by some wealthy sponsors to raise him. And he lucks out, which means he gets education because he's taken in by a wealthy family. In his early 20s, by chance, he becomes friends with George Washington. And this relationship would serve him well for the rest of his life. He will serve as Washington's personal secretary during the war. Now, when the war is over, he marries a wealthy woman. Yep, he got a sugar mama. So he marries a wealthy woman. Again, this frames his life, right? Now, politically speaking, Hamilton, far more than maybe any other founding father at the time, he believed in the great potential of America. He believed that America could be great. He believed in the economic and political potential of this new nation. But, this is a big but, Hamilton puts all his faith, all his trust for the future of America in the wealthy and the educated. Yes, the orphan boy who was forced to be taken in by wealthy sponsors, who married a wealthy woman, puts all his faith and trust in the wealthy and the educated. He argues that we will only be a great nation if we rely on the wealthy and educated to lead it. In fact, he has a great disdain for common and uneducated people. You have to be an elitist to have any potential, according to Alexander Hamilton. And so very early on, Hamilton gets up and he gives his vision of the new government the United States should have. Now, I know you all listen to my lectures, and they all run usually less than 60 minutes. I'm sure you're all exhausted by the end of them. Maybe some of you even slow down the speed and play at a slower speed so you can hear me, all my words enunciated. Alexander Hamilton, when he stands up at the Constitutional Convention and gives his vision for this new government, delivers a 6-hour speech. Yes, you heard that right, 6 hours. Now, good news for you, I'm not going to make you read it. I'm not going to make you listen to it. In fact, I'm going to sum up his 6-hour speech in about 20 to 30 seconds. You ready? He says that the United States should have a Congress, and they should be elected for life. Then he says we should also have a president, this brand new creation, and he should be elected for life. Check my time. I think I beat 30 seconds there. After his 6-hour speech, delegates stand up and give him a standing ovation. Now, maybe they were applauding his plan, maybe they were applauding that he finally shut up. I don't know. They say, Alexander, seriously, that plan was genius. Where did you ever come up with that idea? I mean, it's revolutionary, it's amazing, it's wonderful, but it'll never work. He's like, what? Why? It's like, seriously, dude, a Congress elected for life, that's just like Parliament. A president elected for life, that's a king. A king by any other name is still a king. Call him whatever you want. Hamilton is so butthurt. He storms out of the convention and never returns. Now, don't worry, he'll be back later when we actually form a new government. So he'll be back, don't worry. But after he storms out, everyone says, phew. Now that Hamilton's finally gone, let's get back to the order of business and focus on a real proposal. Now, again, everyone has their own proposals, but it comes down to two major plans. The first one is known as the Virginia Plan, proposed by James Madison. He argues that we should have a government that should have a lower house that will be elected by the people. We should also have an upper house, known as the Senate. Those things sound familiar, they should at least to you. But he argues that the Senate will be chosen by the lower house, not by the people, which is pretty accurate. He also argues that we should have a president, this brand new position, that will be chosen by Congress. Now, what's the issue with this? Because the House is elected by the people based on population. So what is the problem here? So if the House, this House of Representatives, is elected by the people based on population, and then the House votes on the Senate, and then the House and Senate vote on the president, it gives big states, like Virginia, his home state, a lot of power. So if you're a small state like Maine or Vermont or Rhode Island, you hate this plan because it gives you basically no voice in government and gives all the power to big states like Virginia. And then, of course, the other issue is how do you count representation? I mean, how do you count your population? Does it count everyone? Do you just count people who own land, so men? Do you count women? Do you count children? Do you count enslaved individuals? And of course, Northerners say, no, you treat them as property anyway. Why would you count them? We don't have any. The other plan we have, of course, was the New Jersey plan designed by William Patterson. He argues for a unicameral legislation, so one legislative body. So no House and Senate, just one body. But he wants equal representation for each state. So every state gets, say, I don't know, 2 people. So what's the problem with this plan? Well, they immediately, the big states like Virginia, all right, wait, hold on. So you're saying that Rhode Island, the tiniest state out there, should have the same voting power in Congress and our government as Virginia, the most populous state? And of course, they hate this. And so these are huge stumbling blocks. Hamilton plan is out. The 2 major plans that emerge are the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And basically, no one knows what to do. We're at a stalemate. The Constitutional Convention, everyone decides, you know what? We've been at this since May. There's a July 4th, the holiday's coming up. We're going to celebrate our independence again on July 4th. And so everyone kind of goes home for the holiday. However, one delegate and a couple other people around him stays around, decides, you know what? I have an idea. And of course, that man is Benjamin Franklin. Now, Ben Franklin here, and you don't need to write this slide down, we'll talk about this slide later. Ben Franklin sticks around, and he has a new plan, known as the Great Compromise. Now, to hear about the Great Compromise, though, come back for my next lecture. This is what we call in the lecture world a cliffhanger. And so until next time, we'll hear about this Great Compromise and say all the wonderful things that Ben Franklin did. But until then, take care and bye-bye.